Well, hey, Josh, here we are for Sunday school on November 1st in this little thing that we're calling God and Politics in the Body of Christ, subtitled, What Could Go Wrong? Thank you for taking time to be part of this. Why don't you begin? I know who you are, and some of our members may know who you are, either from the fact that you're a member at St. Albans or you work at Baylor, or maybe both. But why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what you think?
Sure thing. So I do work at Baylor. I'm in the Office of Spiritual Life, and I'm the Assistant Director of Spirituality and Public Life. Um, my training, I'm a ordained minister, and also my doctoral work was in rhetorical theory and criticism in communication studies. So, one of the things I do here in my role is I was co-founder, co-creator of the Baylor Public Deliberation Initiative. Public deliberation work comes out of communication studies and is very interdisciplinary. So it's cuts across a lot of disciplinary lines. And basically, it's a way to do democracy differently, is what we say, and a way for us to have hard conversations with each other about tough topics, and a way to feel like we're not just talking about talking, because that's my least favorite thing to do is talking about talking.
Well, I'll be sure not to do it today. Very much. Gosh, now I feel nervous about what are we going to talk about? Well, okay, so you you and I had the idea to do this because this will be broadcast on November 1st. We had a gap in our Sunday school calendar. Next week we start with our series on what it means that Christ is the King as we enter into Advent. We just finished walking with Alan Jacobs. We just finished walking through the Psalms with Steve Reed. So we're just drawing on the riches of Baylor University, and I was thinking, gosh, November 1st, an open Sunday, right before a presidential election, when all of our political anxiety will be at a fever pitch. Let's bring someone in to help us have a conversation as Christians about all this sort of stuff, because there's a real challenge in front of us. So I was listening to a podcast this past week where a dad who is a Republican, he's part of Latinos for Trump in Arizona, and he was talking to a reporter about a conversation via text that he had with his daughter, who's very progressive and voting Democrat. And he wrote to his daughter, "Can we have a conversation about this?" And she said, no, just wasn't even willing to go there. So that's one thing that some families do, some people do. And then there's the opposite of that, where every time you get together with your family, it's sort of like, I don't know if you, I only saw this show on reruns, but the one with Archie Bunker, All in the Family, and Rob Reiner and all that, when Archie Bunker and Rob Reiner would always just go at it, political arguments, and there's families like that. This summer, we spent some time with the extended family. I'm sure many people have done the same, and not everybody agrees on all the things. And there were some heated conversations. We absolutely did talk about it. I don't think anybody's mind was changed. And so this is something that I'm sure everybody watching this could relate to, maybe even you, and I won't make you talk about your family and all that, but but we would hope that as Christian people, I don't know about the world out there, but as Christian people, we would hope that we'd be able to talk to each other, respectfully, compassionately. But it seems like that's not always happening. So I hope this isn't talking about talking. What do you think gets in the way? For example, that table I sat around this summer with family members where people had lots of different perspectives. I think everybody around that table would at least identify as a Christian of varying levels of commitment. Some haven't been to church since their baptism, some maybe a little bit more frequently, but they would all identify as Christians. So what is getting in the way for people trying to have these conversations?
Well, I mean, there's quite a few things that get in the way. Um, I would say one of the main things is, in a lot of ways, we've really lost our ability to have um, to practice democratic skill sets, right? Our civic capacity, our civic infrastructure is not quite as robust as it might need to be for us to have these really hard conversations. Um,
What do you mean our civic infrastructure?
like we haven't built a culture of civic engagement really and civility. Uh, we often there's been some work done on what's called theologies of conflict, and a lot of times we sort of opt out because we are afraid of conflict, right? And so we talk about the church being a family. And one of the ways that we can gloss over conflict or get around conflict is to pretend like families are always supposed to get along, right? But as we know, that's not always true,
Mine does.
right? I know yours does. Um, so I think that's part of the issue is just we're very uncomfortable when it comes to conflict, and we don't have the civic capacity to sort of engage with that conflict in a healthy way. Because, honestly, what we do now is if you disagree with me, then I'm just not your friend anymore,
Mm.
right? We tend to think of like, we tend to think in very extreme terms. Like if you think of a Disney universe
Mm-hmm.
where you have absolute good and absolute evil. And if you disagree with me, then you must be inherently evil. We tend to split everything into binary terms. And none of that really is like helpful because it's not really based in reality. Um, we polarize when we should be coming together to have tough but healing conversations about difficult choices. The problem is, we instead of saying like we have tough choices that we need to make together, we talk about people making good and bad choices, right?
Mm.
And like if you make a bad choice, then you must be this evil person. I can't have
Right.
anything in common with you. And we forget that we actually have shared values. We don't necessarily have different values. Now, what we say when we talk about public deliberation is that, for example, in America, we tend to share the values of liberty, justice, freedom, equality, safety, and security. These are values that we all share in common. Uh, Now, we may rank those values differently, and that's when we start talking about a value hierarchy.
Yeah.
So, for example, this is the example I usually use. If we're going to come together and have a conversation about immigration policy, and I value safety and security at the top of my value hierarchy, and you value equality at the top of yours, we're going to vote very differently on immigration policy. But that does not mean that I don't value equality and you don't value safety and security. It just means that we're prioritizing those values differently.
Yeah.
We still share those values, so that means that we still have those values as common ground where we can come together and talk. Um, and then the other thing to note is that our value hierarchies are constantly fluctuating, right? Depending on whatever we're talking about. And sometimes, back in the day when we used to use airports, sometimes value hierarchies, things are pushed to the top of our hierarchy, whether we want it to be or not. If you go to the airport and you want to use the airplane, safety and security goes to the top of your hierarchy. Freedom sort of drops off the bottom, right? And that's because we want to use the efficiency and the productivity of the airplane. And they say, like, great, if you want to do that, then give up all your freedoms. And we say, okay. But I mean, that's just an example of how our value hierarchies are constantly moving to different priorities. Which is not to say that we're morally ambiguous. It just means that our shared values are constantly moving around, depending on the issue that we're talking about. So I
As
think you go ahead.
Well, I think, one of the things that was really helpful that you said was the fact, it was kind of a light bulb moment for me, the fact that we tend to have this Disney universe where we see, team A is all good and team B is all bad, whether it's Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal,
Right.
Baylor, TCU, whatever. Like we do
Exactly.
tend to, actually that one, we're pretty clear on that. But the that's sort of that's, as you said, very simplistic, almost like childlike thinking that something would be all good or all bad. I mean, it's no surprise that that's how Disney draws us in, because that's a comforting world to live in. Because obviously, if there's an all good side and all bad side, I'm going to be on the all good side, and then I'm all good. But we've actually made it a moral. We've used moral terms to describe something that many times is not moral. Like I think about if I were to go to Home Depot to buy a new refrigerator, and I'm looking at one that has a touchscreen panel that can talk to me and be connected to the internet, and one that's just like a white normal refrigerator that has no internet capabilities, those are not good or bad choices. They're different choices. There's pros and cons to both of them, and we can talk about what makes the most sense for our needs. And I think about something like the healthcare debate in this country, and there's not necessarily like the side of moral goodness and the side of moral evil, although that's often how we talk about it. It's like people need healthcare. There's different ways to provide that. It's incredibly complex. There's probably infinite number of ways a society could structure that, and with each one of those structures comes some trade-offs. There's pros and cons, and as you say, we have to make some tough choices. But again, so often it's like, are you on the side of good or on the side of evil? It's like, well, that's like, this refrigerator is not evil,
Right.
but we sort of talk about it in that way. And I think, so that was I'd never really, I mean, I think when you said it, I was like, oh yeah, we do that. But I think a lot of us don't maybe always realize how we've couched the terms, which almost makes conversation impossible, because if you're bad and I'm good, I don't have to listen to you.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also tiring because it's polarizing. And polarizing means we're dealing in extremities. Uh, and extremities are always exhausting. And when you are able to dismiss someone in a very dualistic, binary way, you're evil and I'm good, uh, it saves you the trouble of having to go into some sort of tiring back and forth with them, right? So, but one of the things I like about public deliberation is it depolarizes conversations. But I find a lot of parallel between public deliberation principles and Christian principles. So, like I've said, dualism and binary, and so the alternative then is non-dualism, and sort of this like not engaging in either or thinking,
Mm-hmm.
which is a logical fallacy anyway, but it also leads us into polarization. And non-dualistic thinking is found throughout. If you look at when we look at Paul, and he's talking about.
I know where you're going, and I'm excited.
Yay! I hope you know where I'm going.
I think I
Uh,
do.
we look at Paul, and he's encouraging us to become more mature and to let go of childish things. As you were pointing out earlier, the Disney universe is a very childish way to sort of look at reality, and he begins to point out there's no longer male nor female and Greek nor Jew, and he's getting us out of this sort of binary way of thinking
Yes.
about things. And Jesus does a very similar thing when he starts taking apart our understanding of neighbor and enemy, and he's like,
Yeah.
stop thinking in these binary ways. Loving, the practice of loving your neighbor is the ability to exchange yourself for your neighbor, and now you're exchanging yourself for your enemy. You're trying to see what it's like to be in their shoes, which is what public deliberation is trying to get us to do, is to see these other perspectives so we can stop turning our neighbors into enemies, and we can start turning our enemies into neighbors, which is what I think we need to
That's
be.
awesome. I want a bumper sticker. It'd be a long bumper sticker. I
It's a
need a
long
long,
bumper sticker.
but stop turning your neighbors into enemies. Start turning your enemies into neighbors. So I'm reminded. So I was thinking absolutely of what you said. That Paul says in Christ, they're neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, male nor female. He totally dismantles those categories. and I was also thinking about how when he did see conflict in the church, you made that point early on that we tend to avoid conflict, which, as Christians is sort of silly because we have these great stories of conflict in our own text and resources to deal with conflict. So Paul looked at communities of Christians where you had people that come from a more Jewish background and people that came from a Gentile background. They're now all followers of Christ, and some of them still want to keep old Jewish traditions regarding circumcision or diet and what you eat, whereas the Gentiles, not so much. And Paul didn't come to them and say, your side is right and your side is wrong. What he gave, it was a very adult way of thinking, in that he said, we have different convictions, to your point about different values.
Yes.
To you, this may be really important, and to you, this other thing may be really important. But he says the only thing that really matters is love, is how we treat one another, and whether it's ancient ideas about meat sacrificed to idols, or our current debate, many debates. And Paul says, how could I ever do something, even if I know it's right and aligns with my values? How could I do something that causes an injury to the conscience of my brother or sister, my sibling in Christ? How could I do those things and hurt someone for whom Christ died? Which puts, he's basically saying you have to think about how your actions will affect other people, and put yourself in their shoes. And I saw somebody with a political flag recently, and it was advocating a certain candidate, and it also said in very coarse language, your feelings don't matter, vote this candidate. And I thought, that's an interesting perspective, but it is not a Christian one, because a Christian will always want to look with compassion on a neighbor and care very much about what's inside them. And you read in the New Testament, Jesus all the time looking at people and knowing what's in their heart. And because of that, like their feelings, their emotional life, and loving them in that. And so I think, this, one of the questions I wanted to talk to you about was, what resources do Christians have when they come to a polarized conversation? And you've talked about identifying kind of dualistic thinking, and we have resources to move us away from that. You've talked about the Christian call to love our neighbor and to see people who we think of our enemies as neighbors. Love your neighbor doesn't mean love everybody who's exactly like you. The Good Samaritan story tells us that loving your neighbor means loving the person who's different from you, seeing the different person as your neighbor. What do you want to say about that? And are there other resources that Christians have from our tradition, from our texts, in these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, Jesus, being the great spiritual genius that he is, says such a simple thing, but means such a big deal, right? It's like, okay, if I love my neighbors and I love my enemies, there's really nobody left to hate.
Ooh,
right? And so
spicy.
this idea of love, and Paul's eloquent philosophical treatise on love in 1 Corinthians 13 is just fantastic and really pushes us, because he says if you're not doing that, then all you're doing is making noise. All you're doing is talking about talking.
You're a banging gong or a
and,
clanging cymbal.
and I would say that is where you get away from politics as a healthy engagement with community, and you move into partisan polarization, and that's sort of the piece that gets us into a lot of the troubled areas, and that's where the dualism comes in. But it's a lot easier for our brains, right? Our brains are efficiency machines that want to conserve glucose at all costs, and so if you can split the world into
Get out of here with your science.
yeah, if you can make everything either or, then your brain's going to try to do that because it's a lot easier.
Yeah,
But
than
the
having
problem
complex
is,
thoughts. Yeah.
but the problem is like, if we want to engage with Christianity on a deeper level, then we have to be able to engage in paradoxical, non-dualistic thinking, which means that
like Jesus is both God and man at the same time.
I was actually going to use that example. Yes,
Like God is one, but also three,
I
but
was
not
also.
three in one, or
That's
one divided into three.
so. See, I mean, uh,
We have all the treasures in our little treasure chest
I was
here.
gonna say Christians should be like amazing at paradox, but we're not so great. But we have the resources for sure. I mean,
You know what we're good at though? Casseroles. Super
that
good.
also, I would say that's paradox.
Can there be a
Casserole
good
is the
casserole?
embodiment of
Is
paradox.
is that such a thing?
I think, the ability to engage through paradox is what allows us to realize that our shared values are being prioritized differently when we're engaging with someone on a tough topic, right? It allows us to say, okay, you're not evil just because you disagree with me, and I can see where you're coming from. So that's the like place where you want to be. That's the place that you want to get to.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we get to that place is not by, let me give you all of my logic. Let me give you all of my evidence. That's what we think we're supposed to do, and that's what we do a lot of the times.
Let me forward you this meme.
Yeah, that's a great one.
That always works.
What the research mostly indicates, though, is that if you come at me with your logic and your evidence, I'm going to become more entrenched in my own position. I'm not going to be persuaded to you. Now, on the other hand, if we do what Christians are really great at, and that's to share our stories with each other and to get to know each other on a personal level and to open our hearts to one another, that is how I can be persuaded to a particular way. Or you said earlier the thing about convictions, and I want to make it clear, like when I talk about public deliberation or even how it's connected to my Christian practice, it does not mean you're abandoning your convictions. And it does not mean that you're leaving all of your beliefs and convictions at the door so we can find some sort of lowest common denominator. That's not what I mean. I mean that you actually do have to bring all of your convictions with you in humility and in compassion so that we can have conversations together about the ways that we disagree. And I can say to you, I still disagree with you, but I know where you're coming from.
Uh,
That's a big step forward.
yeah, and I think I've been thinking a lot lately about the relationship, the friendship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Scalia. That was really highlighted in the press when Ginsburg died recently. And here you had somebody who, on one side, was an originalist in terms of constitutional interpretation, somebody in Justice Ginsburg who was more had a different perspective. I'm not a legal scholar, so I can't use all the terms, but definitely these were people who were on opposite sides politically in almost every way, and yet they loved the opera, and they clearly loved each other and had a great friendship. And I think what struck me about looking at those two people is that they, I think, had a really good understanding of where the other person was coming from. Ginsburg understood the arguments behind Justice Scalia's positions, and Justice Scalia understood the arguments behind Justice Ginsburg's positions. I think so much of the conversations around political issues in this country, they don't get very far because we've not taken the time to listen and try to understand, okay, why do you support universal health care subsidized by the government, or why do you not support it? What's important to you about that? Why, really understanding the arguments, the viewpoints, and the values that motivate those things on both sides. I think we tend to make a caricature of our opponents' beliefs and agreements with slogans and sound bites and don't get into the complexity of it. So,
Right.
how do we fix this? Tell us, Josh. Dr. Ritter, tell
Okay,
us.
I will tell you. Well, to be quite honest with you, one of the
I hope you were being honest before, by the way.
that
This
is a
isn't
good
like a
point.
shift in the conversation.
That's a good point. I'm moving away from deceit now, and
Before I was lying, but everything else now is true.
so a couple of things about our ability to just have a conversation and build a relationship, right? One, we usually want to be. I think it's Richard Rohr who said you have to want to. The relationship has to be more important to you than wanting to be right.
Mm,
And I think that a lot of times we just really just want to be right. And we think that if we're wrong about one thing, then we might be wrong about everything. And that again is back to the like binary either or logic,
mhm.
that traps us in a lot of like pain and suffering. But um, just to say like I would rather be in relationship with you than be right is a
Mm,
is a significant spiritual discipline, a practice of charity and humility. Charitable listening is a big thing that I think a lot of Christians don't actually practice. We usually think of charity in monetary terms, but being charitable with our time and our energy and our listening is also a way to practice charity in a very tangible way. I think a misunderstanding of the nature of problems themselves is actually a big problem. The problem with problems
mm.
is we think of problems, they're all the same. They can all be solved in the same way. But usually there's two main types of problems. There's what we call tame problems, which are usually technical problems that have technical solutions. Like I need to build a dam, so I go and I ask an engineer how to build a dam and they tell me. Easy, tame problem. But then there's
I'll solve your damn problem.
Oh, that was a
Hey.
good one. That was a good
Yeah, I
one.
can say it because it's not a curse word. It's just
That's right,
DAM.
because it is a damn problem.
Yeah.
Um, the other is an adaptive problem, which unfortunately is mostly what we deal with, right? All of our main social issues and problems are not tame problems, they are adaptive problems. And adaptive problems are hard because they don't have solutions. And that is kind of freaky for us because we think all problems should have solutions, but they don't. In fact, any solution you come up with for an adaptive problem generates additional problems. This is why
Yes.
it's called an adaptive problem. Sometimes people
Right.
call them wicked problems. Um, and so, but it shouldn't deter us from talking about them. It just means that we need to continue to talk about them and continue to come up with action plans and ways to solve things in an ongoing way, right?
Right.
So if
Hence
I
the name
had,
adaptive, I guess, right? Like you put in
yeah,
a solution that you then
right,
have to adapt and respond and continue. It's an iterative process.
right. So if I had a conversation with you, the issue of immigration is a good one because it's one that's been going on for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So, but like 3,000 years ago, if we didn't solve the problem of immigration, and in the 1950s we didn't, and in the 1960s now we had different solutions,
Right.
but they change over time. And so that's sort of the idea, is that you approach an adaptive problem in a very different way than you approach a tame problem. One of the things that public deliberation highlights that's important and also key for Christian practice, I think, is this ability not only to highlight shared values, so we're engaging in a process of love and compassionate communication where we're not just making noise and yelling at each other or past each other, which I think is where Paul was going with that.
Hmm.
Um, but our speech and our thoughts and our action are all coming together as we try to communicate from our heart. Uh, and so we have that desire for compassionate communication, but also looking at trade-offs and consequences. That's something that we don't usually do, and it's something that you were sort of like getting at earlier when you were talking about Paul. Instead of going in, like you said, in a very immature way and saying, like, oh, you communities, like, you want to do this and you want to do this and you're right and you're wrong. He didn't do that. He went in and he said, these are tough choices, and complex issues, and he looked at the sort of trade-offs and consequences of the various options, right? And that's what public deliberation is great about, getting everybody to kind of slow down,
Yeah.
getting everybody to say, like, okay, great. If you want to take these actions, that's
Right.
great. But what are the trade offs and consequences, not just for you, but for your neighbors, for other
Hmm.
people groups, for whatever? And so once people start to look at those trade offs and consequences, they really do start to have a very different understanding of the nature of the problem itself.
Yeah, so I think about some interesting things recently, examples of people being surprised by the consequences of views that they had. There was a story of a town, I believe in Tennessee, that had a large poultry processing plant that had a lot of undocumented workers. And it was a community that voted strongly for President Trump in 2016. And in large part because of at least some of the population there's views on needing stricter immigration policies and enforcement of existing laws. It came home to roost. It's a chicken joke.
Got it.
When
Nice.
those policies were implemented and those laws were enforced, and federal agents came in and rounded up dozens, if not hundreds, of undocumented people and deported them and separated a lot of families, and these were the neighbors of the people who had supported these policies, and the people who supported the policies suddenly faced a reckoning and were like, wait, we didn't think this was going to happen. I also think about a community on the Upper West Side in New York City they were a very progressive community in general, and during the coronavirus pandemic, there many of these buildings, these apartment buildings, nice doorman type apartment buildings, were opened up to the homeless population of New York to allow them ability to socially distance and be safe during the pandemic. So vacant apartments were given to these folks. These are folks that value highly, compassionate social programs that deal with problems like endemic homelessness and poverty and all that. And when that policy, though, caused a homeless person to be living in their apartment building, they were not so keen on that, and lawyered up and got it changed. So there's lots of times where we have values and commitments, but we haven't actually thought through the consequences in a way that we can, okay, well, maybe do I want to change my position? Maybe yes, maybe no. If no, I have to be prepared to deal with the consequences of it. If yes, how do I do that? So again, adaptive problems. And I think again, you've hit on another really important point, which is think about the policies that you're advocating and try to think through some of the consequences and just be aware of those and realize that your solution isn't a perfect one, which would lead to humility, which I keep coming back to in our conversation. The thing that I keep thinking about is the lack of humility
Yeah.
on all sides in
Right.
this. That whole idea about choosing the relationship over being right.
Yeah.
And I know I've been in situations where like, no, I want to be right. It's not that I want to be right. I am right. And I will not give that up. And that's pride, because
Yes.
I've heard this in sort of, I'm an amateur counselor, like any pastor, like, people come to us with their problems, and a seminary professor told me, many of the marriages that you see and you deal with, you'll see this dynamic at work. You can either be right or you can be in a relationship. It's the same thing that Rohr says in political conversations, but also in family relationships. And if you are not willing to yield and have some humility, you will be right, but you will be alone.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We are right. See?
We are right. Yeah, I mean, it is humility. I mean, for me, it comes back mostly every single time to the Beatitudes, which I think are Jesus's foundational practices for how to follow him, right?
Yeah. Blessed are the
Um,
poor. Blessed are the poor.
yeah. So
Blessed are the, yeah.
the first one is like, blessed are the abjectly impoverished of spirit, right? The If you're empty spiritually and you know that you are, that is humility. That is the first sort of like, I have to admit that I have a problem and I need healing, right? That
Yep.
is Because
Step one of the 12 steps, right?
Jesus's way is the self-emptying love way, which is what Christians call kenosis, which is
Yes.
also another word for humility. You're emptying yourself out,
Philippians 2, the kenotic hymn.
right? So I think, yeah, I mean, the first beatitude is about being spiritually humble, which means that you're just humble, throughout your entire being, right? You have an open heart, you have an open mind, and then as you walk through the Beatitudes, it sort of breaks your heart open more and more as you go along. You're mourning for your neighbors around you because you have compassion. You become attuned to the suffering of your neighbors and your enemies around you. That requires humility, courageous vulnerability. You become more gentled by God, which is that idea of meekness, right? It's not that you're a doormat, it's that you become gentled by the Spirit, by the movement of God's Spirit, which is what Jesus called the kingdom of God, right? And so it's that non aggressive, patient gentleness that comes when you are then hungry and thirsty for justice, right? And I think that as you move through the Beatitudes, and what follows the Beatitudes is when Jesus then says, love your neighbor and your enemy. And then he also follows that up with, hey, by the way, if somebody hits you on one cheek, you should turn the other way, right? So you get the other cheek, which is not Jesus's advice to stay in an abusive relationship, but a way for him to make the point, I think with hyperbole in this case, which is, I think, a favorite thing that Jesus uses is
Pronounced hyperbole, Josh.
it is. Sorry, I didn't say it in the correct pronunciation.
That's
Um,
right.
is a way for Jesus to say, when we can let go of our ego,
Mhm.
when we can let go of the desire and the need to be right, then maybe we'll see the kingdom of God. Maybe we can touch the living Christ who is the Christ of love. And maybe we can manifest that love in our own lives if we are gentle enough to say, you struck me on the cheek. And I have a feeling it's much more about your suffering than it is about anything to do with me.
Mm.
How are you in pain? And how can I listen to you to help you in your healing?
Ooh, that's the spicy chicken sandwich right there. I
So
mean,
it's
and that's that.
hard because like Christianity's hard, Aaron.
Yes, because it does. See, if you acknowledge that your enemy, quote unquote enemy, has pain,
Yeah,
you've now acknowledged his or her humanity.
right.
You've acknowledged they have a life story before they met you. They're
And you
carrying all
can't,
kinds of burdens just like you
yeah,
are.
and you
And
can't
these are things
demonize
we
them
believe.
anymore.
Go ahead.
You can't demonize them and dehumanize them once that happens. So you
And
can't
then where's the fun
polarize
in
them.
that?
Right.
It's so fun to be angry all the time. But I think, the Christianity is hard. And what's ironic is that we say we believe these things. Love your neighbor as yourself. Compassion is good. Everybody's got that reclaimed palette wood spelling out live, laugh, love, and in their kitchen, or we do grace and we do messes and we do
Right.
forgiveness, or we say all these things, but when it comes to actual living it out, it is very hard. We often don't do it because it is so hard. And one of the things you've said about PDI, public deliberation, this tool that you use and have used in congregations and other settings, is that it's a way to practice these abstract ideas of Christianity,
Yeah.
the abstract idea of grace, abstract idea of compassion, abstract idea of forgiveness, and taking the place of your neighbor, stepping into his or her shoes, and
Right.
loving them. What are some of the things you've seen when you do that in groups of people, particularly in congregations? I mean, what is it like for churches
Yeah.
when they have to do this stuff?
Well, one, I think first I want to say it can be extra hard for Christians because Christianity in particular tends to be very interested in the right belief instead of the right practice.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Right? We talk
Mm-hmm.
about orthodoxy and orthopraxis. Christianity historically has always really focused on like, do you have the right beliefs? And so but it's harder for us to sort of put all those things into practice because we haven't focused on the practice as much. But I like what the way that we're talking. I like this because love your neighbor as yourself is not a belief; it is a
Right.
practice, right?
Right.
Uh, the way that it plays out in churches that I've seen, and several St. Albans folks have participated in public deliberation forums in partnership with First Pres, and we've also done some workshops where several St. Albans folks have come to those. So we should ask them as well. But the way that I've seen it is kind of what I was saying earlier. People walk away and they go, now, and remember that public deliberation, like the point is not consensus. The point is,
Winning.
yeah, the point is not winning. The point is that it's not like I'm trying to change your mind. That's not the point. I want you to think differently about the issue when we're done talking, but don't necessarily need you to change your mind. So what I've heard people say is, I really see where you're coming from now.
Mm.
I still don't agree with you, but I really understand where you're coming from. And that's really sort of the heart of the Beatitudes,
That's
right?
huge.
Is that idea of understanding. Deep understanding of our neighbor is precisely what Jesus, the whole thing is like, he's trying to get us to say, like, how can I more deeply understand my neighbor?
Yeah.
And that is the result of a lot of these conversations using the tool of public deliberation is a rich and deep conversation.
I want to bring up one other scripture verse. And since you were raised in the Baptist tradition, I know you know it. It comes from that early Christian hymn that St. Paul writes in, I think it's Philippians. It could be Ephesians. You tell me. You're the Baptist. Christ did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but instead emptied himself. That's the kenosis word you brought up earlier. Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a slave and humbling himself even to death, even unto death on a cross. So this is God doing the thing that you've talked about in terms of, you can choose to be right or you can choose to be in relationship, in a sense where
Yeah.
Jesus did not choose to stand on his rights as the incarnate Word of God to zap all of the evil human beings for being naughty, which they absolutely were. And he, could have had every right to do. People were self-absorbed, hurting each other, hurting themselves, and just basically making a wreck of everything, just like today. But he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but instead he emptied himself, taking human form. So this is like the best example of all time of coming to somebody with, in some sense, you have an adversarial relationship, but instead of coming against them, you actually step into, quite literally, into their shoes, into human flesh. Because Christ is able to then restore the relationship. I think also about the woman caught in adultery, where he could have been right and cheered them on as they stoned her to death, but instead he forgives her and restores her into relationship with God and with her fellow human beings. And there's just so much of that, but we don't do it. And I'm simultaneously encouraged, but also a little bit discouraged as I'm thinking about this, because I know myself and I know people, and I know how we really hate to do this. So what hope can you give us as this airs on November 1st, 2 days before the election? What would you want to say to people that want to think about their just how they approach the world politically as Christians, in light of what we've talked about today? Who should they vote for, Josh?
Yeah, I think we should just turn to Ecclesiastes, abandon all hope of hope. No, I actually think it is hope. Let's not say hopeful. I think it is healing. I think it can be healing. Because we're talking about our intense shared woundedness. and trying to make sense of it. And maybe we're going about it the wrong way by always trying to be right about everything. And maybe, just maybe, Jesus is showing us a different way. When I read that verse that you were just quoting, I always think of idolatry, and I think about idolatry a lot, actually. um,
Sinner.
not in the ways that I've heard some pretty terrible sermons about idolatry, at being Baptist, but um, idolatry is again, back to humility, just the acknowledgement that we tend to turn God into an idol because we tend to worship the thing that we want. Um, and so I see the fact that Jesus does not grasp at the idol.
Mm.
He doesn't. We tend to make our egos into gods and then worship them. And so, how can that? You can't never admit that you're wrong when you do that, because as soon as you do, then you realize your ego is not a god and you don't know everything and you don't have all the power and control in the universe and you don't have all the handle on safety and security and all the things that you want. So I think the shared practice together, the acknowledgement that we're all wounded together, that we all have shared pain and suffering, but also joys together, that we have stories that we can share together, that we're on a journey together, that we're in community. And yes, maybe we're in a sort of diaspora right now because of Zoom calls and COVID, but we are still the body of Christ. We all still can come together in ways that are loving and not where we're all yelling past each other and making noise. We don't have to engage in politics the way that culture tells us to. And I just want to say that again. We don't have to engage in politics the way culture tells us to, because culture tells us to engage adversarially. And that is not the way, as you said, that is not the way of Christianity, to engage with one another in charity and humility and love and compassion. We're not engaged in a win-lose scenario, which is a zero-sum game. We're engaged in a win-win scenario whenever we take the time to sit down and build the relationships where it's no longer about being right, it's about being in that sort of caring and compassionate relationship with somebody else. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. Hey, it was an open-ended question. There's no right answers, Josh. I'd rather be in a relationship than be right. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, which we're not going to. I will be thinking about our conversation tonight. We're recording this on the day of the final presidential debate, so we will see again a more adversarial relationship tonight. And that even that structure does not really permit what we're talking about very easily. But it makes me realize how radical this whole Christianity thing is, that you would see your enemy not as your enemy, but as a neighbor, and understand where they're coming from. Anyway, it's a big deal. A lot to talk about for another time. I'm grateful for your time. Thank you very much, Dr. Josh Ritter of Baylor University. Thanks for your time. And I hope that in the future, when we return to a time when we can get together more easily in the same physical space, that we can maybe as in our congregation, I've talked about this, but hopefully we can do a PDI session, public deliberation. We can get together and put this into practice, actually live out what we say we believe in our Christianity. So we look forward to that day. But thank you again for your time.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. Anything else you want to say before we go? Okay. Thanks,
no, I'm
Josh.
good. Go and love.
That's right. To love and serve the Lord. Thanks, Josh.